Next year, I'm teaching grade 10 science for the first time in many years. And so I'm trying to front load as much of my planning now so that I can protect my time over the summer and actually get a break. So I thought I would share my process with you and how I use certain frameworks to stay organized as a teacher. So in this video, what I want to do with you is share with you my framework where I come up with 16 learning outcomes for a semestered course in high school science. And then I use that framework for all of my planning. So this helps make sure that I'm not doing this crazy day-to-day planning and scrambling at the last minute to know what I'm teaching. And it helps me really focus and hone in on my curriculum. It gives me a built-in buffer. So, things always come up when we're teaching, and this sort of process and this sort of framework helps me to plan for those buffer days in advance. And it helps me to plan so that I'm not bringing work home at night or on the weekends. So let's kind of jump in and take a look at how I'm planning my course. All right, so the first thing I do is I kind of map out my semester, and typically where I teach, our semesters are 20 weeks long, or approximately 20 weeks long. So I always create this planning doc that I'm showing you here that has my entire semester laid out. So we start quite late next year. We start on the day after Labor Day with teaching students. Now, wherever you're teaching, it might be earlier than that, probably earlier than that. We are quite late where I am. And so I will go through, I'll put in all my dates, and then I will also put in and look up any holidays. So we have Labor Day and Thanksgiving. We also have a few PD days in there, and so I put those dates in there as well. I also put in our winter break, and I put in our exams towards the end of the semester as well. From there, what I also do is I look up all of our important reporting dates. Here in Ontario, we have formal reporting periods at midterm, so 10 weeks through our course, and then our final reporting date, which happens at obviously the end of the semester. But we also have some informal reports. We have our 5th week and our 15th week reports, which are emails home for students who are not achieving success in our classes. The other thing I need to consider is our summative task and our final exam prep kind of days. So at the end of a semester, typically what we do for our final sort of 30% of our course is it's broken down into a summative or final performance task, which can take about a week worth of class, give or take, depending on what you're doing. And then exam review, and then exams happen. And so I'll plug those dates in there as well. Now, you can get a kind of sneak peek here. I have all these Thursdays highlighted off in red, and it says LO1, V1, LO1, V2, LO2, V1, so on and so forth. Those are my checkpoint days. And I'm going to create a whole other video talking about my checkpoint system and how that helps me to make sure I'm not bringing home any kind of grading whatsoever, and helps me to get all my grading done in school. So watch out for that video. I think I'm going to make that one next, so you can check that one out next when it comes out. So given all those holidays, given all the PD days, whatnot, it really works out nicely that I have about 16 good solid weeks with probably all the interruptions and whatnot in there, and my final performance task and whatnot. And so what I do is I break my courses down into 16 learning outcomes. And I have an AI tool for that. I actually use a Gemini gem that I've created, and I have that in another video. I'll link that video down in the description below, so you can go check that out if you'd like to see a little bit more about that process and how I go about doing that. So for my grade 10 science here, I'll flip over and I'll show you. These are my 16 learning outcomes. Now, I keep them very focused on and centered on the content that I'm teaching. And I do something a little bit differently for lab skills. So I'll talk about that in a moment as well. So, in my curriculum for grade 10 science, we have 4 units. We've got biology, we've got chemistry, we've got physics, which is an optics unit, and then we have climate change. So, because I've got 4 units, I like to keep around 4 learning outcomes for each unit. And this way, I know that as I'm assessing my course, that I am giving a pretty much equal weight to all of the different units without having to think about weightings or how I'm going to put this in my grade book, because I'm already naturally designing for that as I'm kind of going through. So you can see I've got 4 learning outcomes here on biology. I've got 4 on chemistry, 4 on physics. I have 3 on climate change, and then I have 1 on just sort of like safety and inquiry as we're getting started with the course. Okay, so once I've come up with those 16 learning outcomes, that is really the full basis of my planning and my strategy for how I go through a semester. So coming back to my planning doc then, what I can do is I can pace out my course where students are doing and focusing on 1 learning outcome every week, because I've planned for 16 of them, and I have roughly about those 16 weeks within a semester where I can focus on true content. That it works out so nicely to just basically pace it out 1 learning outcome a week. And I can do this because I create all of my lessons with a flexible pacing kind of model as well, based on the Modern Classrooms Project Learning Framework. If you want to go check out a little bit more about them, I'll leave a link in the description below for you. But that sort of helps me really kind of hone in and think about my planning in a weekly sense rather than a daily sense. So when I'm going through and I've been planning this course, I am planning it by learning outcome, and that's really helped to keep me really focused and centered on what I'm doing. Now, typically when I'm planning a week at a time and a learning outcome at a time, I try and keep the number of lessons to 2 to 3 lessons per learning outcome. I find that hits the sweet spot in terms of flexible pacing throughout the week. And I add some differentiation in there in my lessons as well. So it allows some students to spend a bit more time on things and less time on others as we're kind of working through. That leaves me with plenty of room to be able to sprinkle in a ton of whole group activities. So typically when we start out class, we start out with some sort of warm-up activity, or we might be looking at an application of that learning outcome that week. YouTube videos, discussion, things like that before students get into flexible pacing for the week. And then my goal is to really plan at least 1 lab activity every week as well, so that we're engaging with some hands-on learning that goes along with that learning outcome for the week. So you can see in my blank sort of template here, I got learning outcome 1, 2, 3, and so on, all the way down here. So it works out that if in an ideal world, and we know this doesn't happen, that there are absolutely 0 interruptions throughout the school day, which is not happening, I would be finishing my learning outcome 16 on the week that we get back from our winter break, which leaves me about a week's worth of buffer time in there before we need to start our summative task. So with all the interruptions that happen, and we all know they happen, it works out perfectly that I can kind of pace these at 1 learning outcome a week, which is awesome. And it allows me to add in all those other really great activities as well that keeps my students engaged and builds our classroom community as a whole. So like I said, I keep my Thursdays as checkpoint days. I do have a midterm test, which brings together the first 8 learning outcomes, or the first half of the course, that I assess together. And I do that right before midterm reporting time. And then we obviously have our final exam, which takes care of the rest of the learning outcomes and puts everything together at the end of the course. So, because everything's tied to these 16 learning outcomes, all of my grading is tied to these 16 learning outcomes as well. And I do grade based on mastery. So, like I said, I'll create another video and talk about that. But it allows me to set aside a very regular schedule that my students know when assessments are coming and how many opportunities and what learning outcomes we're focused on. So, really, the idea is we're doing a learning outcome one week and then assessing it the next week, and then assessing it the week after one more time if needed for those students. So I can just show you an example then of the one I've kind of been building for my grade 10 course for next year for the first semester. And I've been kind of popping in my lessons on here as I've been building them. And so you can see that it's being populated with all of the different lessons. Now, I usually name my lessons like 1 point whatever or 2 point whatever, and that's based on the learning outcome numbers. So everything stays super organized and very clean and easy to find for both me and my students, which is super helpful. So we've got, for example, 2 lessons in my learning outcome 1. We've got 2 lessons in learning outcome 2. We've got 3 lessons in learning outcome 3, and so on and so forth. And when I do lab activities, I try to like to keep them on a same day as well. I've got them in my calendar here on Fridays just to kind of remind me that to put in a lab activity that goes along with each of the learning outcomes, which is really, really important to me that we're doing lots of lab and hands-on work. But they may not come on Fridays. Like I have stuff in here day to day, but I'm not locked into staying to this particular schedule day to day, which is really nice because then I'm not freaking out when something comes up at the last minute and plans have to change. So you can see I've got my whole course planned out here, and there are days that are blank, and that's because I know some of those learning outcomes are going to take a little bit longer, or kids are going to need a little bit of extra time with some of those concepts. And we're flexible pacing through the week. So as long as we're getting through those couple of lessons every single week, it's all good. I haven't put them all in yet, but like where I'm finding really interesting YouTube videos like this one on like, why do we have to wear sunscreen to go along with our cell division and talking about cancer and how that comes about. I'm finding those and popping those in because then as a class, we can watch those together and do some of our discussion together about those really sort of relevant emerging kinds of topics that go along with the actual content that we're learning too. And then as I'm kind of building here, I'll also build those warm-up activities. And usually I'll do 2 or 3 warm-up activities in a week too, depending on what labs we're doing or what other videos and discussions and things that I have in there. So that's kind of a gist on where I'm going with all of this. You can see it's all in there. I have all the way up to learning outcome 16. I've kept my buffer week in there knowing that things will happen and those days will get used up. They're not going to just be blank and no learning happening at all. So I find that this really helps to keep me very organized. And like I said, I'll have another video coming out soon about my checkpoint system and what those Thursdays mean and how I use that. I also am thinking if you're interested, I'm going to create a video all about how I organize course materials for my students as well I'm going to be trying out Google Sheets next year. And so I'm going to kind of see how this works. And I guess we can call it vibe coded this sheet one day just to create some cool functionality. But you can see all of my lessons are kind of divvied out here, and I've been building up all the instructional materials as I'm going as well. So it's really great for me to focus on my planning. Gives me some really concrete goals. It actually chunks out my planning as well, so it makes it not seem like this big insurmountable thing that I need to do. So what I'm going to do is down in the description below, I'm actually going to put a link to get a copy of this semester planner for you if you want to grab a copy of that. So it'll include the blank template here. It's just for semester one, but like you can always go in and change all the dates and stuff, and make it work for your particular school year, along with an example of my 16 learning outcomes and an example of my semester calendar already put in. So if you would like that, go get that in the description below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.